So for instance, I'm trying to write a piece right now about the nature of power, but we
Hmm.
have to be very clear about the term. The term, I think, is muddied because we say power, people typically think political power, like who's in a position to tell others what to do, position of authority, something like that.
Hmm.
But there's also power in the purely physics sense, which is like the capacity to do work, right? That's
Hmm.
something we very much want to maximize. That's the basis to wealth in a lot of ways. That's what we're doing when we trade, right? We're increasing the division of labor, so we're increasing our aggregate physical power, effectively our ability to move goods and services. It's what innovation does, right? It amplifies human labor to create a more powerful outcome. So there seems to be this, the way I'm looking at it right now, and this is not fully formed. So uh, we want to create social institutions that allow us to maximize our physical power collectively. But we want those same institutions to be resistant to political power, right? We don't want insiders to be able to, say, twist a public institution for private gain, right? That would be a
Right.
pretty bad idea. Corruption
Right.
is what we would call that typically. So
Yeah.
it's a dance, I don't know. I think Bitcoin, you asked me earlier about Bitcoin. It's like, I think it's a very promising social enterprise, and that it enables you to directly monetize energy and then transact that money in a rule set that can't be politically co-opted. So it's a system that like incentivizes us to increase our physical power harnessing, but that's resistant to political power. Um,
Mm.
Sorry, that's kind of a mouthful. I would love to
No,
hear your
no,
thoughts on
no.
power in general too.
Yeah, yeah, no, no, no. Thank you for sharing that. And most of, if not all of my thoughts are ill-formed and still forming. Um, but yeah, I think I was intrigued by you sort of focusing in on the physical power element, and the physical power of labor. And I don't think you mean that in the literal sense, because what is it, like 84% of S&P value is now intangible. So um, but and yet this is like another dichotomy that I'm interested in. But we live in this embodied reality, and I
Mhm.
think we tend to sort of over index on the intangible as it relates to thinking about, especially now, thinking about economic value. But yeah, can you describe why you phrased it that way with the physical power?
Yeah, I would say even the intangibles, like in the S&P, I know there's a lot of intellectual property, for instance, but these things ultimately ground out in capital, right? You're producing capital of some kind ultimately, otherwise it wouldn't matter. A patent, for instance, on whatever device would be considered intellectual property,
Mm-hmm.
but that patent is not going to have value in the real world unless it can do something, right? Move something or create a service that people deem valuable. It ultimately has to create an impact in physical reality. Otherwise, it doesn't tend to be valuable. So something that can't create an impact in physical reality, then what use is it? Um, and I guess it does get a little blurry when you look at like art. There's this idea of aesthetic value. Is a painting really, like, what's the physical power of a painting? Not really much. Um, but people will expend tremendous resources, bidding over one another to get it. So
Right.
I think there's just this, we could say like the explosion in car ownership or the explosion in people using air travel. Like there's this natural desire in organisms really to be free, to have a lot of options, to be able to move across time and space. Now, time, clearly we're all stuck in time, but you can use a piece of capital to
Mm-hmm.
accelerate you towards your aim in time. So the example I always give is if you have a pair of shoes, a trip from New York to LA is going to take you one set of time, maybe a few months. But if you amplify your labor into a piece of capital like a car, then you've now been moved nearer in time to your goal. And if you
Mm-hmm.
amplify your labor into an airplane, you're even nearer in time to your goal, even though the spatial relationship between New York and LA hasn't changed at all. So capital is like this amplifier of human time, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I think that capital accumulation itself, which is the basis of civilization, right? It's a buffer against uncertainty. It's what we use to satisfy our wants better, faster, cheaper. To create capital requires physical power, ultimately, requires physical production. So we need to amplify our physical power through the division of labor, through innovation. And that's what lets us move, better, faster, cheaper in the world. But with all that, kind of getting back to the imagined orders we described earlier, which is like, you could say this is narrative, basically. There's people fighting over controlling that narrative too, because to control that narrative is to control the production capacity that it enables to some extent. So that's the duality I'm looking at. It's like there's this political power where someone can like speak a thing into existence, right? If I'm Joe Biden, I can sign an executive order and I can mobilize millions of people to do things at the stroke of a pen. That's political power. But physical power is the actual act itself, like to actually get into a plane and ignite the ignition and it propel you across the ocean in a few hours. That's physical power. You can't do that without the physical power.
Right. And an act of creation of some kind.
Yeah.
It's that I like that description, and I sort of wish it was more representative of how current economic systems function, because I think that's where with the financialization of the firm in particular, you see these kind of manipulations of value, which actually in many ways don't have any sort of linear correlation to an exertion of physical power or creativity or innovation. And I think like one of the examples I used as well was that Apple's operating income hasn't changed in 6 years, and yet the company value has gone up 4 times. And in part, that's because they've done $337 billion worth of stock buybacks, which is essentially just it's just a manipulation of what's available on the market. And so or I think I also used the example of like Tesla, which actually made more money selling Bitcoin and regulatory credits. And maybe in your mind the regulatory credits and the Bitcoin are part of this physical power manifestation of things flowing, but it's certainly, at least for the average person, they don't think that Tesla's making its money that way. They think it's making money selling cars to people, right? And so I think like markets are in such a strange place right now, or even the derivatives market, right, which has been, some estimate it's at like a quadrillion. There's quadrillions of like units of value that flow through them, and it's not clear to me that betting on the future is a form of manifesting any kind of physical power as you're describing it. Right.
Yeah. And just for perspective, that derivatives market is valued at multiples of global GDP.
Right. Exactly.
It's like, it doesn't even make sense, right? There's so many.
Yeah.
If the whole market collapsed, you can't even pay out all the notional value of the contracts that comprise the derivatives market, because it's bets about the future. So you can have as many bets about the future as you want, which makes it so hard to value and all of this. But
and even like the idea of like fractional reserve banking, right, which now doesn't exist anymore in the US. But that idea that you can, continually fabricate more and more sort of money supply, without any sort of like inherent tie. And I know, people have different thoughts about that, and you need some ability for the monetary system to expand. And but it's clear that there's a term like growthless asset maximization, which basically I think describes the US economy now, which is you don't actually have to, as a company, you don't actually have to grow. You don't have to become more productive. You actually just figure out a convoluted scheme of investment shell companies and, and moving things around on your balance sheet to be able to capture some sort of like theoretical economic value, but there hasn't really been any sort of market exchange which would